There is a particular smell that lives only in memory now. It is the smell of old carpet warming under morning sunlight. The smell of a television set that has been left on all night. The smell of a house key, metal and warm, hanging from a shoelace around a child's neck. If you were a teenager in the 1980s, you know this smell, you know these textures, and you carry within you a psychological architecture that the world may never see again. We are about to explore something remarkable. We are about to understand why the teenagers of the 1980s developed a psychological profile unlike any generation before or since. This is not nostalgia. This is not about claiming that things were better then. This is about understanding how a very specific set of circumstances shaped the inner lives of millions of young people, and how those inner lives still echo today. Consider the narrative of a typical 14-year-old in 1984. It is 3:15 in the afternoon. School has ended. There is no parent waiting at home. There is no cell phone to check. There is no social media feed to scroll. There is only a key, a door, and silence. This was the latchkey generation. Children who came home to empty houses. Children who learned very early that they were responsible for themselves. Now here is where the psychology becomes fascinating. That silence was not experienced as loneliness by most of these teenagers. It was experienced as freedom. Pure, unfiltered, radical freedom. For 3 or 4 hours every day, they were the masters of their own small kingdoms. They made their own snacks. They decided when to start homework. They chose what to watch on one of 4 or 5 television channels. They learned to be alone with their own minds. This aloneness created something precious. It created the capacity for what psychologists call internal world building. When there is no external stimulation constantly demanding attention, the mind begins to create its own entertainment. It begins to imagine. It begins to wonder. It begins to think deeply about things that matter and things that do not matter at all. The teenagers of the 1980s became experts at being inside their own heads. We can see this pattern clearly in the story of a composite latchkey teenager. She comes home at 3:30 to an empty apartment. The television offers nothing interesting. There is no computer. There is no video game console yet. She lies on the carpet and stares at the ceiling. She notices how the light changes as clouds pass outside. She starts to wonder about the clouds, where they came from, where they are going, whether anyone else is looking at them right now. And slowly, without trying, she begins to think about the nature of time itself, about how this moment will never come again, about how she will be old someday and maybe remember this afternoon. This is philosophy happening naturally. This is the birth of deep thought. Think about what this means. Every single day, for years, these young people practiced the art of solitude. They practiced sitting with boredom. They practiced letting their minds wander without direction. This is not a small thing. This is the foundation of creativity. This is the seedbed of original thought. This is how human beings learn to know themselves. But something else was happening during those quiet afternoon hours. Something that shaped their psychology in ways they could not have understood at the time. They were developing what we might call a tolerance for uncertainty. When you are alone, you must make decisions without asking anyone for approval. When you are alone, you learn that most problems can be solved without intervention. When you are alone, you discover that you are more capable than you thought. This psychological resilience was reinforced by the physical world they inhabited. There were no tracking devices. Parents could not send a text message to ask where their children were. Once a teenager left the house on a summer morning, they might not return until the streetlights came on. During those long hours, they learned to navigate the world without a safety net. They learned to read situations. They learned to trust their own judgment. Now we must examine another crucial element of 80s adolescence, the nature of boredom itself. Today, boredom is treated almost like a medical condition, something to be cured immediately with a swipe of the thumb. But the teenagers of the 1980s had no such cure. When boredom arrived, they had to sit with it. They had to let it wash over them. They had to find their own way through. This forced confrontation with boredom created a remarkable psychological adaptation. These teenagers developed deep wells of inner resources. They learned to entertain themselves with nothing more than their own thoughts. They learned to find interest in small things, a crack in the ceiling, the pattern of light through window blinds, the way dust floated in a sunbeam. They became observers of their own existence. There is a concept in psychology called high trait introspection. It describes people who naturally turn their attention inward, who examine their own thoughts and feelings with curiosity rather than fear. The conditions of 1980s adolescence were almost perfectly designed to cultivate this trait. Hour after hour of unstructured time, no external validation available, only the self sitting quietly, learning to understand itself. But let us turn now to the social dimension of this generation's experience, because here we find another fascinating contrast with the present moment. The teenagers of the 1980s lived what we might call hyper-local social lives. Their friendships were built on physical proximity. Their social world extended only as far as they could walk or ride a bicycle. Consider what this meant for identity formation. When your social world is limited to your neighborhood, your school, and perhaps the local mall, you experience social feedback in a very particular way. You cannot curate an online persona. You cannot present different versions of yourself to different audiences. You are simply you, the same you, in every context. The you that walks to school, the you that hangs out at the convenience store, the you that everyone in your small world has known since childhood. This created a kind of psychological groundedness that is increasingly rare today. Your identity was not something you constructed. It was something that emerged naturally from your relationships and your environment. You did not have to wonder who you really were, because everyone around you already knew. There was no gap between your public self and your private self. There was just you. Consider another illustration of this phenomenon. A composite teenage boy in 1985. He is known in his neighborhood as the kid who is good at drawing. This is not a brand he has created. It is simply what everyone has observed since he was small. His drawings hang on refrigerators up and down the street. His identity as an artist was not chosen or curated. It grew organically from years of observation by people who actually knew him. This is a very different kind of identity formation than what happens when you can present yourself, however you wish to, an audience of strangers online. The social world of the 80s teenager was small enough to be truly known. You could not hide parts of yourself. You could not pretend to be someone you were not. The neighbors had watched you grow up. Your friends had seen you at your worst and your best. There was a kind of accountability built into this social structure that produced genuine character rather than performed character. The social mirror of the 1980s was also remarkably forgiving. Embarrassing moments did not live forever in digital archives. A foolish thing said at a party was not recorded and shared. The natural human process of making mistakes, feeling ashamed, and then moving on, was allowed to function as intended. Teenagers could try on different identities, make terrible choices, and then quietly reinvent themselves. The past did not follow them with such relentless persistence. Now, we must address the shadow side of this era, because no psychological portrait is complete without acknowledging the darkness. And for the teenagers of the 1980s, there was a very particular darkness hanging over everything. It was called the Cold War, and it shaped their inner lives in ways that are only now becoming clear. Picture this. You are 15 years old. It is 1983. You have just watched a television movie about nuclear war. The images are horrifying. Entire cities reduced to ash, families torn apart, the slow death of radiation sickness. And here is the crucial psychological detail. You have been told, by authorities you trust, that this could happen at any moment. There are bombs aimed at your hometown right now. One person making one wrong decision could end everything. This was not abstract fear. This was not distant anxiety. This was a constant, background hum in the consciousness of an entire generation. The big red button, the launch codes, the missiles hidden in silos, the submarines lurking beneath the ocean. At any moment, without warning, the world could end, and there was absolutely nothing you could do about it. Psychologists would later recognize this as a form of collective trauma. An entire generation growing up under the psychological weight of potential annihilation. But something interesting emerged from this darkness. A kind of psychological urgency that shaped how these teenagers approached their lives. The nuclear anxiety of the 80s did something peculiar to the developing mind. It created a strange double consciousness. On one level, you went about your daily life, school, friends, music, television. On another level, you carried the knowledge that all of this was fragile, that the permanence of the world was an illusion. This double consciousness produced a particular kind of wisdom in young people, who should have been too young for such wisdom. They understood impermanence before they understood much else about life. We can see this dynamic clearly in the music they loved, the films they watched, the art they created. There is a melancholy thread running through the culture of that decade. A sweetness mixed with sadness, an awareness that beauty and destruction were always sitting side by side. The teenagers of the 1980s absorbed this awareness into their bones. It became part of how they saw the world. When you genuinely believe that everything could end tomorrow, you develop a particular relationship with the present moment. You do not defer joy. You do not wait for the right time. You live now, because now might be all there is. The teenagers of the 1980s carried this urgency in their bones. It made them passionate. It made them intense. It made them determined to wring meaning from every available moment. This explains something that often confuses younger people about Generation X. Their combination of cynicism and romanticism. Their ability to care deeply while also maintaining an ironic distance. They learned early that the world was fragile and possibly doomed. And they responded by deciding to love it anyway, to find beauty in it anyway, to make meaning in it anyway. Let us now fast forward. These teenagers grew up, they became adults, they had children of their own, and they carried with them all of these psychological traits that had been forged in those quiet afternoon hours, in those hyper-local neighborhoods, under that mushroom cloud sky. How do these traits manifest today? The most obvious manifestation is a remarkable tolerance for solitude. Adults who were 80s teenagers often possess an unusual comfort with being alone. They do not experience solitude as punishment. They experience it as restoration. They can sit in silence without discomfort. They can travel alone without loneliness. They can spend hours in their own company without reaching for distraction. We see this in the way they structure their lives. Many of them have created careers that allow for independent work. They are writers, designers, consultants, entrepreneurs, roles that reward self-direction and do not require constant collaboration. When they do work with others, they often prefer deep one-on-one conversations to large group meetings. They learned how to think alone, and they still think best that way. This capacity for solitude is increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. In a world that constantly demands our attention, the ability to simply sit with yourself is almost a superpower. These individuals can think deeply because they learned how to think deeply. They can focus because they spent years with nothing to focus on but their own thoughts. They can tolerate boredom because they survived so much of it. There is another trait that emerges clearly, a kind of practical independence that can sometimes appear as stubbornness. These are adults who learned, at age 10 or 11, to solve their own problems. They do not immediately call for help when something goes wrong. They do not panic when faced with uncertainty. They figure things out, because figuring things out is what they have always done. This independence extends to their relationship with authority. Having spent so many hours without adult supervision, they developed a healthy skepticism about whether authority figures really know best. They question instructions. They think for themselves. They do not automatically defer to expertise. This can make them difficult employees but excellent entrepreneurs. They are not comfortable being told what to do. There is also a particular kind of social intelligence that emerges from hyper-local adolescence. These adults are often remarkably skilled at reading rooms, at sensing the dynamics of groups, at navigating complex social situations. They learn these skills in real time, face to face, without the mediation of screens. They can detect subtle shifts in tone. They can read body language with accuracy. They understand, intuitively, how to connect with other human beings. But we must also acknowledge the challenges. Not all of these psychological traits are adaptive in the modern world. The tolerance for solitude can become isolation. The independence can become an inability to ask for help. The skepticism of authority can become a reflexive rejection of expertise, even when expertise is needed. Every psychological adaptation has its shadow. There is also the matter of how these adults relate to technology. Having grown up in a world without it, they often have an ambivalent relationship with the digital realm. They use it, of course. They have adapted to it. But they remember a different way of being. They know, in their bodies, what it feels like to be truly unreachable. And sometimes, this knowledge makes the constant connectivity of modern life feel like a kind of invasion. Many of them struggle to understand why younger people seem unable to tolerate even brief moments of solitude. Why the phone must always be present. Why silence feels threatening rather than peaceful. This is not judgment. It is genuine puzzlement. They remember boredom as a friend. They remember empty time as a gift. The idea that someone would fill every moment with stimulation seems, to them, like a kind of self-abandonment. And there is something else, something harder to name, a kind of sadness that lives beneath the surface of many who grew up in this era. It is not depression exactly. It is more like a constant awareness of loss, an understanding that something precious has slipped away and cannot be recovered. The world of their childhood, the world of empty afternoon hours and bike rides to nowhere, That world is gone, and no amount of nostalgia can bring it back. Now we arrive at the heart of our reflection. What has been lost? Not just for this generation, but for all of us. What does the psychological profile of the 80s teenager teach us about what it means to be human? The answer, I believe, has to do with a particular kind of unreachability. The teenagers of the 1980s were unreachable, not because they were aloof or disconnected, but because there was simply no way to reach them. No cell phone, no social media, no GPS tracker. When they walked out the door, they disappeared into the world. And that disappearance, that temporary unreachability, created a space for something essential to develop. Think about what this meant practically. A parent could not text to check in. A friend could not send a message to change plans. Once you left the house, you were operating on your last known information. You had to think ahead. You had to be resourceful. You had to trust that things would work out even without constant communication. This built a kind of confidence in your own ability to navigate the world. And there was something else too. When you are unreachable, you are also unobserved. No one is watching your location on a screen. No one is monitoring your communications. You exist for a few hours, completely outside the gaze of others. This is where the self can breathe. This is where experiments with identity can happen safely. This is where mistakes can be made without permanent record. In that space of unreachability, the self could form without constant interference. In that space, boredom could work its quiet magic. In that space, independence could take root. In that space, young people could make mistakes and recover without permanent consequences. In that space, the inner life could flourish. Today, we are all reachable. All the time. Our children are reachable from the moment they wake until the moment they sleep. Every thought can be shared. Every moment can be documented. Every interaction leaves a trace. There is no space of unreachability. And without that space, something important is being lost. This is not a call to return to the past. That is neither possible nor desirable. But it is a recognition that certain psychological capacities require certain conditions to develop. The capacity for deep thought requires extended periods of solitude. The capacity for independent judgment requires time away from the opinions of others. The capacity for self-knowledge requires the willingness to be bored. The teenagers of the 1980s did not choose these conditions. They were simply the circumstances of their time. But within those circumstances, something precious was cultivated, a depth of inner life that served them well and continues to serve them still. If you are one of these individuals, honor what you carry. That tolerance for solitude is a gift. That independence is a strength. That ability to sit with your own thoughts is increasingly rare in this distracted world. You learned in those quiet afternoon hours how to be at home in your own mind. That is not nothing. That is everything. And if you are younger, if you did not grow up in that era, know that these capacities can still be developed. Solitude can be chosen. Boredom can be embraced. The phone can be put away. The unreachable state can be temporarily recovered. It requires intention now in a way it did not then. But the inner rewards are the same. We have traveled together through time and through the landscape of psychology. We have examined a generation forged in specific circumstances that no longer exist. We have seen how those circumstances created traits both wonderful and complicated. And we have reflected on what their experience might teach us about our own lives. The forgotten freedom of the 80s teenager was not really about freedom from rules. It was freedom from constant observation, freedom from perpetual reachability, freedom from the need to perform identity for an audience. In that freedom, something deep was allowed to grow. Perhaps that is the lesson. Not that we should return to a world without technology, but that we should protect fiercely and intentionally some space in our lives where we cannot be reached, some hours where we are alone with our thoughts, some moments where boredom is allowed to do its work. The deep thinker within you, regardless of when you were born, requires these things: solitude, patience, time, the willingness to sit with yourself even when it is uncomfortable, the courage to be unreachable in a world that demands constant connection. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for being willing to think deeply about these questions. If these ideas resonated with you, please share this video with someone who might benefit from it. Leave a thoughtful comment about your own experiences with solitude and boredom. And consider what small changes you might make to create more space for your inner life to flourish. We will meet again soon. Until then, be gentle with yourself and with your deep need for silence and solitude.